of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
This is a cover that was flown on the famous Hindenburg airship back in 1936. Not a random pull from the box, but one that I received a lot of messages about from the video on collectible covers. So let's examine it further. This philatelic cover was sent from Württemberg in Germany to an address in Glen Rock, New Jersey in the United States. And we can see that from the postmarks as well as the date 1st of May 1936. Actually, when we look at the back of the cover, we can see additional postmarks for the 9th and 11th of May when it arrived in the United States. There is a cachet indicating that this is to be flown on the airship Hindenburg, leaving from Frankfurt and set to land in Lakehurst, New Jersey. There is also a confirmation airmail hand stamp with a plane and Zeppelin crossing the Atlantic, as it's specifically for Europe to North America, and this is registered mail. Two of the stamps feature the Imperial Eagle soaring over the globe with the Nazi swastika symbol as the sun. These stamps were airmail, as we can see by Deutsche Luftpost at the bottom. The stamps that I'm most excited to explore are these commemorative airmail ones featuring the LZ-129 Zeppelin crossing the Atlantic Ocean to North America. The LZ-129 was the Hindenburg, and this cover was sent on its first flight to North America. So it's a first flight cover with the stamps that were issued for this event. The stamps were issued during the same month that the Hindenburg began service and less than 2 months before its first flight to the United States, which is very cool. The blue one has a face value of 50 Reichspfennig, while the green is 75, and this discoloration around the edges of the stamps show that the gum used on the stamps contained sulfuric acid. The dimensions of these stamps are 23 by 27 millimeters, and they were issued back in 1936. Airships are lighter than air aircraft, essentially a balloon that may or may not have a rigid or semi-rigid frame and be filled with a gas such as hydrogen or helium that could allow the aircraft to float through the air and carry people, cargo and mail potentially over long distances, including oceans, such as the Hindenburg, which carried this particular item of mail from Germany over to the United States. The LZ-129 Hindenburg was a rigid airship that was built by the Zeppelin company, and you can say that it was a symbol at the time for man's achievement of owning the skies. This thing was massive. 803.8 feet long, a diameter of 135.1 feet in the center. It was more than 3 times the length of a Boeing 747, just to give you some idea. Experimentation with the concept of airships really happened in the second half of the 19th century, the idea of putting propellers on a balloon and trying to steer it. Well, the most successful was a former general in the German army and later turned inventor, Count von Zeppelin. He was successful in building the airship LZ-1 in 1900 and improved on his designs until his death in 1917. Zeppelins were used in World War I for reconnaissance and bombing. They bombed London and Paris, and although their contributions to the war were insignificant, just imagine seeing a giant Zeppelin dropping bombs on your city. It must have had a psychological impact. They were sometimes referred to as baby killers. After the war, the Allied powers insisted that Zeppelins were handed over as war reparations. Other countries were making their own airships, and the Zeppelin company eventually began making the LZ-126, which was given to the United States and was the most successful American ship, known as the USS Los Angeles. This just proves that Zeppelin was still king of airship manufacturing. 2 years later, in 1928, the famous LZ-127 was produced and was named Graf Zeppelin after Count Zeppelin. This circumnavigated the globe in 21 days, went to the Arctic, and became the first regular airship line across the Atlantic, taking passengers between Frankfurt, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and New York. And this brings us to the LZ-129, the Hindenburg. We know it because of its famous disaster back in 1937, which I'll get to, but it was first flown in 1936 and was named after President Paul von Hindenburg. He died in office in 1934, making way for Hitler to claim supreme leader and chancellor. Now, the Hindenburg was actually intended to be filled with helium, a much safer gas to hydrogen that all the other German Zeppelins were filled with. But the United States was the only country that had access to large quantities of helium, and due to an export ban in the US, they had to fill the Hindenburg with hydrogen. Now, what also made the ship different, other than its size, was that it was used for propaganda by the Nazis. The Nazi party that was relatively new in power was using every opportunity to make an impression. It took part in propaganda flights before making its first voyage across the Atlantic carrying passengers from Germany to Rio de Janeiro. It had the name Hindenburg printed in red 6-foot-high lettering and giant Nazi swastikas on the fins. Later in its first year, the Hindenburg made 10 round trips to North America carrying people, freight and mail. This giant Zeppelin with Nazi swastikas was actually flying over Manhattan. Now, it landed in Lakehurst, New Jersey, which is about a 2-hour drive south from Manhattan. And I had the privilege of visiting this joint air and naval base where the Hindenburg and other Zeppelins landed. I got to see Hangar 1 that still stands there today and was used to house the giant Zeppelins, including the Hindenburg. It is enormous. Apparently the Hindenburg just fit inside, leaving 18 inches of space at each end. That's like this much. I was escorted around the base by very knowledgeable guides, one of which actually witnessed the Hindenburg fly over his house on its last flight when he was a young boy. I was also given the opportunity to look at some other philatelic covers on display at the museum, one of which was clearly on board and managed to remain undamaged from the Hindenburg's fiery end. The Hindenburg, of course, caught fire on its first flight to the 1937 season to North America, right at this airbase. Other artifacts that I got to see on display included part of the airship's frame and silverware and drinking cups that the passengers used. Seeing the items from the airships really got me thinking about what life must have been like on board of an airship such as the Hindenburg. I wonder. It was luxury. Imagine watching the world pass slowly beneath you, but not too slowly because you'd make it to the other side of the ocean in just 2.5 days. Oh, coffee, just black please. It was an easy and pleasurable experience where, according to my onboard information guide, nobody ever got motion sickness on an airship. The Hindenburg had sleeping cabins that could accommodate up to 70 people. There was also a dining room, a reading room, a lounge, a bar. There was also a lightweight piano on its first year of flight. Oh, and a smoking room. Can you believe it? It had a smoking room in a hydrogen-filled Zeppelin. But it was kept at a higher pressure so that none of the hydrogen could leak into the room, but still. It was really a luxurious experience that only the wealthy could afford. Now, let's get to talking about stamps. According to the American Topical Association, there's over 1,000 different stamps that have been issued featuring Zeppelins or airships, and there can be some fun ones to collect, including these ones from Hungary, as well as these ones from the former Soviet Union, mostly showing the golden age of airships back in the 1920s and 1930s. Some of the classics to get that I don't have are these ones from Germany, issued in 1928. They serve the purpose of sending cards and letters to America. It features the Graf Zeppelin LZ-127 over the Earth. The 2 Reichsmark is for sending cards, the 4 Reichsmark is for sending covers, and then there was a 1 Reichsmark issued in red in 1931. That was used for shorter trips or for supplemental postage on longer trips. There is a special issue for South American deliveries introduced in 1930, making note of the different trip. And there are also several others marking achievements such as the polar flights or commemorating other events. In 1938, Germany issued these stamps commemorating the 100th birthday of Count Zeppelin. And of course in 1936, we saw the stamps that were issued on our cover, featuring the LZ-129, the Hindenburg, crossing the Atlantic. These were issued to celebrate this airship. Now, you could write letters and post them while on board the airship. You could also send a wireless telegram if you wished. But much of the mail that was on board a Zeppelin was for philatelic purposes. You see, stamp collectors and collectors of postal stationery couldn't resist getting something that had been flown on a Zeppelin. So many dealers and collectors would send letters through the mail via Zeppelin to themselves or someone abroad, just for the purposes of creating a philatelic cover and souvenir. Oh, that brings me to the ultimate Zeppelin stamps to collect. These 1930 USA Graf Zeppelin stamps. These are in high demand today, but they were not in high demand back when they were issued. So the way the story goes is that the United States issued these 3 stamps for mail going on board the Graf Zeppelin. A green 65-cent one with the Graf Zeppelin over the Atlantic Ocean, a brown $1.31 with the map of the 3 destinations it flew between. New York should really be Lakehurst, I'm just saying. And the $2.60 in blue with the Zeppelin flying over the globe. The plan that the Zeppelin company had was that only 6.5% of the value of these stamps went to the US Postal Service, while the rest was pocketed by the Zeppelin company. It was a way of making money, but it was only for the stamps that actually were sold and ended up being used on mail with the Graf Zeppelin. So the US Postal Service agreed to it and marketed these stamps to stamp collectors, thinking that a lot of them won't be used because they'll be put away in stamp albums, so therefore they would collect the money instead of the Zeppelin company. Also was seen as an act of goodwill towards Germany. Anyway, one major issue was that they were expensive. This was during the Great Depression and very few people could afford them. The set of all 3 was 50 times the price of a loaf of bread. People couldn't afford to feed their families, never mind collectible stamps. 1 million of each stamp was printed. The Postal Service also declared that any stamps not sold after 2 months would be destroyed, trying to hype them up for collectors. Only 227,000 were sold altogether, about 7% of the stamps, so the rest were destroyed. Also, the ones purchased were actually used. Not a good outcome for the Postal Service, but these are now rare stamps that initially were ignored by collectors and are very much prized today. For collectors, these stamps are not just works of art or items of value, but also a reminder of a unique period in time. See, the airship era was short-lived, partly because of the Second World War and the advances with fixed-wing aircraft, and also because of a particular tragic event.
It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you, I can't talk to people. There's friends around there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honestly.
36 lives were lost in the Hindenburg disaster. There was some speculation at the time that somebody may have sabotaged the ship, but the more likely reason is due to pilot error along with poor weather conditions, most notably an electric storm that happened earlier, along with unfavorable wind conditions. It just created the perfect scenario for a spark and hydrogen fire. Now, the disaster was captured on film, photo, and a recorded commentary by Herbert Morrison that was later broadcast over the radio. The disaster was seen and heard around the world. Now, it wasn't the first airship disaster, and it certainly was not the most deadly. The USS Akron crashed in 1933 off the coast of New Jersey and killed 73 of the 76 men on board. And even though the USS Akron's disaster was more deadly, it's the well-publicized disaster, the Hindenburg, that is credited with bringing an end to the Great Zeppelin era. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, as well as make sure you're subscribed to get notifications on future videos. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time.